GCUC is a global co-working and conference community. We've had our fingers on the pulse of co-working since 2012, and we've connected thousands of operators, both in person and online. On the GCUC Podcast, we talk with the people making it happen day in and day out. Let's get to it. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the GCUC Podcast. I am super excited. My friend Jonathan recently wrote a book, and he's joining us on the GCUC Podcast. So, Jonathan, real quick, how are you?
Really well. Thank you.
I love it. Now, we're going to go into my new favorite starter question, which is about your morning routine. So I have found that I think my morning routine is a differentiator, like in my life. So I'm curious about other people's morning routines. So tell me about your morning routine.
So I'm an early morning person. I like to start my morning off a little bit analog. So I get up early. I make coffee using a sort of Italian mocha pot, which is something I learned to do when I lived in Europe. Very sensory smell of coffee, and I make an espresso, and I sit down and I play one single side of a vinyl record while I sip my music and watch the kind of sunrise. And I live very close to one of the linear parks in Hong Kong, so I can literally drop downstairs, go one block, and then I'm on a 12-kilometer linear park along Victoria Harbour, and I've got the skyscrapers of Hong Kong Island on one side and skyscrapers of Kowloon on the other, and it's just a fantastic way to start the morning.
I love that. And I love a mocha pot. I also had to live by one of those for the year that I lived in Italy, and it was kind of fun. And it is a little, I like having, what do you call it? A little daily habit, right? And that just sets you into your routine and gets you going.
100%. It hits a button that sort of pressing a button on an espresso machine just never will. Like it's a lot more, it's a lot more manual.
Tactile.
Yeah, you wake your senses up, and that's why I do it that way.
I love it. So for those of our friends who don't know you, can you give us just a little bit of your backstory and what led you to write a book?
So I grew up as an expat kid. So I spent the first 18 years of my life in the Middle East. I went to university in London and then found myself in Singapore in the early 2010s. So I moved as what was called a trailing spouse. So I moved for my partner's career and gave up mine, and then ended up starting my own business in Singapore. But after a couple of years there, really experienced profound loneliness. And I started looking around to try and find, a community I could join, or maybe if I could get an office, I would meet somebody. And it was just one day walking out of one of these business centers right on the harbor of Marina Bay in Singapore. It's a beautiful location. And I looked at the signboard and realized that there were all of these companies there, that if they'd spoken to each other, it would have been amazing. So at the time, there was Skype, there was this leading female VC who had just been on the front page of the Business Times. There was just this incredible database of people, and no one spoke to anybody. And it annoyed me so much, and I knew that there were more people like me because I kept meeting people who were kind of isolated in Singapore because it's particularly problematic with expat communities, that I kind of bet the farm. So I shut down. I had a PR and branding agency at the time. I shut it down. I bet 100% of my capital on building a co-working space called Collective Works. And we opened in, December, I think it was December 2012. So at Christmas, so we broke all the rules. You shouldn't open at Christmas. Terrible time to open. And I had to learn my lessons the hard way. But from there, it took off. So 6 months in, we were opening 2 more floors at 88% pre-sales. 6 months after that, another floor. 6 months after that, another floor. And soon we had 5 stories of this 15-story building. We attracted the interest of institutional real estate. So in 2016, I entered into a landmark joint venture with a huge real estate company in Asia called Capitaland Singapore. So they have about 180 billion in assets under management. The commercial trust is about 35 billion, obviously changing all the time, depending on what they've bought before or since. And we expanded into super grade A co-working. So at the time, if we go back 10 years ago, nobody believed that co-working to be a luxury product. And so we were one of the first really pioneering super grade A spaces. We opened in the 4th tallest tower in Singapore, sharing a lift stack with JP Morgan. And we did some really radical, really interesting things. So that center was absolutely riddled with sensors and, produced huge amounts of data. It was also a really radical and beautiful interior design, which was inspired by a piece of art. And I worked with a really cutting edge designer to help do that. And so after my own business, I saw there was a bit of a bubble in Singapore and decided to exit my business in 2018, 2019. So I handed over the keys to my spaces in Q1 2019, which in hindsight was excellent timing. I then went to work.
That's the same year I sold.
Well, great minds think alike, Liz.
Yeah, true.
And I then went to work for IWG. So I had a couple of roles with them, but the last role I had was leading operations. So I was managing the construction of 180 partnership locations across Asia. So part of their new partnership program, which is management agreements and franchisees. So the locations that have external investors. And so I'd had various roles. One was in franchise performance, which was coaching the franchisees. One was in sales. So I helped drive the sales teams and build the sales teams for China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand for that process, and then helped with the opening. So that was a really interesting period. And I know that IWG is a slightly controversial figure in co-working circles.
Are you talking about the evil overlord?
We can call them the evil overlords. We can talk more about that later. And I'm pretty sure IWG will accept that moniker as well. So we can.
But you know what? I say that and I'm joking, but like you have to respect Mark Dixon as a businessman and what has been built there.
There's a lot to respect there. And Mark is a fascinating man. So we can talk more about that later. So I worked for IWG for 3 years, and then I was headhunted to come back to Asia and to optimize a 8-country co-working operator for sale. So they asked me to come in, clean everything up, help them perform better, and help them exit. So there are not a lot of people who've sold co-working businesses in Asia. So that was a super exciting project that I've just finished. And then I finished finished the book After Coworking, which has just come out.
And what inspired you to write this book?
So After Coworking is actually my second book. I wrote my first book, which was called Coworking Inc., and that was aimed at educating landlords about coworking. I found I kept having the same conversations with landlords. And I think I've said to you before, Liz, I believe the coworking industry is super underdocumented, and it's really important that we actually capture all the best practices that we're doing. So Coworking Inc. was about the macro trends behind the business, answering the question, which we get all the time, which is coworking a fad? Is it going away? Which it obviously isn't. And then the book After Coworking was a book I wrote because I wanted to look bigger. So if we think about the biggest statistics in coworking, so JLL famously came out with the figure that, I think by 2030, 30% of all commercial real estate will be coworking, which is a figure that everyone uses and repeats. And the big 3 real estate companies have come out with their versions. After Coworking is a book about the 70% of commercial real estate that isn't coworking. So coworking is a phenomenal product, and I really see coworking as a social movement. It's a rejection of commercial real estate at its core, but it needs to be bigger. I get very upset about institutionalized waste, and the building industry accounts for 39% of global emissions. Commercial buildings are operating at 20 to 40% utilization, not lease occupancy, utilization. Mm-hmm. And you put those numbers together and the waste is astonishing. And
and I'm sorry, but I just have to chime in because I've been saying for years, like, this is an industry so ripe for disruption. Like, the fruit is rotted, it's on the ground, it's ripe for disruption. And, I think one of the things that frustrates me a lot is it seems like a lot of landlords are incentivized to keep buildings empty. Like, they're like, oh, I don't want to cut a deal. It's just easier for me to leave it empty, which is horrible for society, horrible for cities. And it's, the rich keep getting richer and we're ruining our cities and our environment in the process.
Yeah, you're describing essentially real estate what's called a discount rate. So in a building, you can leave it empty and it doesn't devalue it because you just discount it. And you kind of say, okay, well, this isn't currently leased, so we won't value it. So the industry has already created sort of workarounds to affect building valuation. So they'd rather leave it empty than take a cheap lease, which is wild because when we look at so many of our biggest and most dense cities, they're overbuilt and underutilized. We have housing crises. We have, lack of space. And then we also have this sort of institutional real estate practice of all the shadow space, shadow vacancy. And we just don't have time for this anymore. The climate impact is too intense. We're now at a global population of 8 billion people. We just can't afford to keep running the way that we've been running, this industry for the last, several decades. Even the concept of a real estate trust, Liz, was invented in 1960. The concept of a lease was invented to cope with farming. Why are we managing modern day tech companies with legal contractual structures that were invented for agriculture? They operate on completely different clocks. And the real estate industry has been fighting this because it's not in their interest. They don't want to do more. They've been making a lot of money, not actually doing very much for a long time. And consistently in a business, their lease is the lowest value add transaction that they enter into. And it's one of their single biggest costs, and it's the single lowest value add, and it's just not sustainable.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. And it's really frustrating. Like, you would think like, oh, there should be amazing deals right now, but there aren't, because people are incentivized to do bad business, which is just counterintuitive. So if your first book was really written to help people understand what co-working is, who is this book for? Is it for that 70%, or is this for the 30%?
So the audience for After Coworking is quite wide. So I've written it for landlords, commercial real estate professionals, brokers, also the people that manage large property portfolios. So one of the personas in my mind was the people in charge, the heads of real estate at, big multinational operators as well. It's also a useful book for co-working operators too, because I have a section in the book where I cover some of the pitfalls and mistakes, the things that we've learned in co-working from other operators. So there are lessons there as well, but essentially what I'm doing in After Coworking is I'm extracting the best parts, and I'm going, this is how co-working has solved sales or the go-to-market strategy. This is how co-working manages to maintain ultra-high utilization rates in our spaces. This is how co-working space drives incredible engagement. What if we took these methodologies, made them bigger, and did them at city level? So how could we change the way that cities are used? How could we use co-working methodologies to place make? And we've already seen building co-working spaces can gentrify neighborhoods. You can actually, you can create a whole ecosystem of supporting businesses around co-working spaces because they're such high foot traffic spaces. But isn't that just a live, thriving city? And shouldn't all of our cities be built that way? And anyway, so it's a bit of a mashup. So I compare, so there's an amazing American activist in the 1960s, a lady called Jane Jacobs, who stopped them putting a freeway through Lower Manhattan. So I take some of her ideology, because interestingly, the Venn diagram of Jane Jacobs and co-working is very big. So she thinks about it in an urban level. I look at the actual planning of cities. I look at urban planning and roads, and I look at how we actually use buildings and optimize them. So it's a bigger book, but it's really about asking the bigger questions.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Love it. And how have you taken your extensive experience living in a bunch of different places and put that in the book?
That's a really great question. So I have lived and worked in 7 countries on 4 continents, which is quite a lot. So I spent 35 years cumulatively in Asia. So that's across the Middle East, Asia Pacific, and Australia. And, I love Asia. It's one of the most ethnically diverse, it's the most populous and one of the most ethnically diverse regions on the planet. And what I love about it is it so sharply puts into contrast how you can't take rules from one place and apply it to another. So co-working and real estate is incredibly human. So the things that you're doing in India do not apply in Singapore because the dynamics of the markets are totally different. Things that you're doing in Singapore don't work in the Philippines or in Cambodia. Those markets are also totally different. Even actually what you're doing in Singapore, it's difficult to replicate in Hong Kong because the building structure is very, very different. So Hong Kong buildings tend to be narrower. They tend to have a much smaller footprint because it's an older city, where Singapore has been largely redeveloped, and you have lots of very large footprint buildings, which presents its own challenge. So I think the impact of that on my writing is it means I'm not prescriptive. I believe multiple things can be true at once. So when I talk about the future of real estate, I kind of talk about, 5 different scenarios. I sort of say how we kind of manage things differently, how we can sell things differently, how we can design them differently, build them differently, operate them differently. All sort of 5 or 6 of those things won't be true at the same time in the same place, but you can pick up a thread or 2 of those and it'll actually help help advance you, whether you're an operator or a lessor. I think the other thing I see from this sort of larger perspective, I describe it as a game of musical chairs in co-working at the moment, which is the co-working operators are now getting so big. We have a number of operators that are over 200 locations that they're starting to behave like landlords because they actually operate more buildings than many landlords do. And then on the landlord side, you've got some interesting landlords that are starting to develop their own flex products. So CapitaLand Singapore, who acquired my business, also acquired several other co-working operators and built a platform. You've also got Cushman Spire and Brookfield in the US who are building their own products, a studio and things like that. So they're actually now blurring the lines between landlord and operator. And then on the third side, you've got some really advanced tenants who are now starting to hyper manage their real estate in a way we haven't seen before. Standard Chartered in Asia took, I think, 90,000 working licenses from IWG, which is pretty radical, and gave them the opportunity to work flexibly across IWG's portfolio. But that's just a simple one. We're seeing, some of the more advanced companies, so IBM, for example, are doing some really clever things with their campuses and creating mixed public-private spaces, which is essentially what you do in co-working. And so if you think of it, the boundaries between all the traditional real estate categories, tenant, landlord, co-working space operator, have all blurred recently, and very much so post-pandemic. And that's also why the book is called After Coworking, because when you can't define who everybody is anymore, we're entering into a new era. And that's really exciting and something just to be aware of.
GCUK is heading back to Manchester and we cannot wait. On Wednesday, 11th of June, we'll be at the Content Studio at Media City. And on Thursday, we'll have our exclusive tours of Manchester's best co-working spaces. Now, if you decide to come, you'll gain actionable strategies from industry pioneers, exclusive access to Manchester's most innovative workspaces, and connections that translate to real business opportunities. It's also a lot of fun. Come for the talks, stay for the people, leave with your next move. Tickets on sale now at uk.gc.co. See you there.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. And then it seems like a lot of this is focused on, really big business and global business. How does like a small or independent co-working space relate to this book?
That's a great question. It's a great question. So you're right that this book is targeted much more at the bigger end of the spectrum. But what a smaller co-working space could take from this book is, one, there's a whole section in the book called The Financial Pitfalls of Co-working. Read that, because it is basically a lesson of all the other mistakes of the people that have gone before you. The other part is there's a section which is called The Winner Takes Most, and it's where I compare our evil overlords, IWG, with the rest of the industry, and it creates the most astonishing graph. So co-working has almost a perfect long tail distribution. So you have IWG at the front of this graph. It's 7 times larger than its nearest competitor, and when you see it visualized, it's quite astonishing how big that is. And then it drops down. Basically, it's like a cliff face. So it drops down to WeWork, and then the next person down is a fifth the size of WeWork. And then by the time we're out of the top 10, we're in single-digit market share. By the time we're out of top 25, we're in decimal market share, so 0.5%, 0.25%. So if you're a small operator in co-working, the first thing is own the fact that you're a small operator in co-working, because the long tail of co-working is where all of the innovation in real estate happens. All of the smartest things that have happened in commercial real estate in the last 15 years have come out of co-working spaces. They've come out of innovative ways of planning, innovative ways of mashing together different communities, innovative event structures. And, I became aware recently there's an incredible co-working space, and they have a demountable partition startup that's linked with them in Silicon Valley. So the demountable partition startup is called Apiro. It's not broadly available yet. It's still being used in quite niche use cases, but essentially they are walls that you can just click into a frame on the ceiling. And the walls have built into them all the lighting. They have CO2 sensors. The walls are spatially aware, so they all know how they relate and connect to each other, and they build live digital twins. So if you take a wall down and click it back up, it actually updates your floor plan on a digital model. And then there's the digital models, because they measure through CO2, they can tell how many people are in a space, how busy the space is, and they can measure utilization without invasive technology like cameras. And even the lighting in these walls is controlled by an app. So you can set it if you want it warm white or cool white, or how bright you want it. And this startup in Silicon Valley, they've managed to reduce the cost of renovating co-working spaces to modify them for clients by some 98%. And they can do renovations in 2 days over a weekend instead of 2 weeks. And they've also designed a modular HVAC system so they can actually literally Lego together the ducting. And it's tied with a co-working space called Workwise.
Yeah, I need these people at GC. They need to be at GC 100%.
I'll invite them.
I'll be hitting you up for an intro there. Like, that sounds amazing. It's so interesting. It reminds me of the early days of a brand in Asia that I'm sure you remember, but a lot of other people probably won't, called Naked Hub. I remember them so well because they had amazing technology where, they were monitoring meeting rooms and delivering coffee to the desk like 10 years ago. Of course, WeWork bought them and that all went away. But yeah, I like how you've really pointed out that co-working is the R&D arm of the commercial real estate industry. And go ahead.
I was going to say, so if you're a small operator, you don't realize the flexibility you have. Your constraints are costs, but actually, as soon as you take on VC money or external financing, the pressure is to scale and it forces you into cookie cutter expansion.
Yep.
So while you are small, while you don't have heavy external funding, you can actually do a lot of experimentation. So to your point, Liz, when I was a small operator pre the funding I did with Capitaland, I built my own co-working software kind of pre-Nexodus. So my spaces ran on a proprietary operating platform. We were putting in occupancy sensors and measuring utilization and meeting room stuff 10, 11 years ago.
Yeah.
The incredible change that's happened in the last 2 years is the advent of AI and large language models and the ability to process the masses of data that comes out of co-working spaces and really deliver incredibly powerful insights. So that's something I also talk about in the book, how the future trends of essentially AI are going to reshape workplace, reshape the way that people work, and even throw out questions like, is a workstation still the right unit of measure in co-working? Should we be planning spaces with desks in them, or should we be planning spaces for something else?
Totally. Like, the fact that desk hasn't been innovated in 100 years needs to tell us something. I mean, there's sit-stand desks, but why are they all square? Like, can't we have more organic shapes? And why aren't they just, growing? Why aren't we just using natural materials and having them sense what shape they need to be?
Yeah, I have a side project where years ago, I thought, gosh, what if IKEA actually did a kind of co-working space line? Because some of their office furniture is actually quite robust. And you know what? I think I might do it. I think I might actually take everything I know about co-working and start designing a really awesome workstation kit for operators, because I think it would be really fun.
Well, and IKEA has gone into the co-working business with their friends at Industrious.
Okay. Did not know that. So thank you. So that's happened. Yeah. And so, one of the things you and I have talked about before is how the co-working industry is kind of undocumented. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah, it's part of the reason why I write my books, which is the co-working industry has been an incredible force for change, but it's full of small operators who are just working really hard on their businesses, and they don't really have time to write stuff out. There are a few people around. Karsten has done incredible data on co-working, and he's critical. He's one of the reasons we actually have any data. You yourself and GC actually are a very important source of reliable data about the co-working industry. But it's important to remember that co-working is a rebellious social movement, and we have to document what we're doing. We have to kind of take the learnings and pass them on if we want this industry to amplify. So I was a very early operator in Asia. So Asia initially adopted co-working far more slowly. So the beginning of my process in co-working was evangelizing and going to events and talking and teaching at co-working conferences and doing, the camps for small operators and teaching them how to build financial models and all that kind of stuff. So I've been doing this, sort of fighting this fight for decades at this point. But it's why I write books, because if it's not written down, it'll be forgotten. And we're such a huge diaspora of operators that we need to share this knowledge with each other. But we also need to just show the real estate industry that there's a better way. And we've already come up with it. And we've proven we've got 30 years of track record.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of the reason we do Juicy, is to pass on the information, right? And to teach each other and to be collaborators instead of competitors. And so I totally applaud that and love that. And I agree with you. One of the things we have is we have a nomenclature problem with the word, because if you say the word co-working to people, they tend to echo back WeWork, or they think it's an open space without office. And so that's part of the reason. I don't know if you heard this part when you were in Boston, but we are launching C20, where we're going to amplify 20 brands that want our help. And it's a collaboration with myself and Sean Yves, where we are actively going to be promoting wins in the industry, people who need to be promoted, brands that need to be promoted. And we will go out and make sure that we're getting covered in the press. We will do speaking engagements, because we've seen that this is a problem. But just like we knew we could move co-working out of real estate and into hospitality, we know we can resurrect the word co-working to mean what it actually is, which is a place where people choose to work that includes offices.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love the concept of C20. And like you say, it's an extension of the work you've been doing for years with the conference, but on an ongoing basis, which is so important. And the interesting thing is actually, so the distribution of co-working spaces I described is almost a clone of the hotel industry in the 1970s before it started to aggregate. You can actually, if you actually put this information, you can put it into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT will explain this to you. But it actually, the distribution of operators in the industry tells you a lot about the stage that we're in. The fact that we have, so while IWG gets a bad rap, IWG actually has proven the model for the industry. They've gone, this is sustainable. You can get this to $1 billion operator, multi-billion dollar operator, and publicly list it and keep it running for, so IWG was founded in 1988, so it's 30 something years old. It actually plays a really critical role for our industry in terms of proving the sustainability. And to your point, I think, while the co-working industry doesn't consider IWG co-working, the broader industry at large and commercial real estate at large don't understand the difference. And but listen, it's okay. Let's embrace them. IWG does own Spaces, which is very much a co-working Dutch brand. And let's just say, listen, that is, as businesses scale, they have to systematize and they have to automate. And that's what IWG has done. So IWG is the most systematized, the most automated of the co-working operators, which is why it feels a lot more corporate or professional or impersonal.
Right.
But it's the only operator that has the scale to deal with the Fortune 500. And that's critical because they occupy a huge percentage of the world's cities.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I actually got a lot of pushback when I started really, bringing a lot of kind of clearly business center businesses into GC, including, Wayne Berger was on stage with me in Salt Lake City year before last. But the thing is, we can learn so much from the people who've gone before us and the people who have better numbers than us. And it's like, we have to open ourselves up to learning from those folks because they have so much to teach us. My actual mentor, who is fantastic, was a business center owner here in Austin who worked with Lady Bird Johnson and then later sold to Regis. And she has been my mentor for 15 years. And I learned so much from her every time I talk to her.
That's awesome. I mean, even in my interviews for IWG, they said, why do you want to work here? And I said, I want to meet Mark. I'm like, the number of people that have started from a sort of a lower economic socio status and become a billionaire in their lifetime, you can count on one hand. So also a business at the scale of IWG, there are some really brilliant people there. Sure, there are things I didn't like, but it's an operator that has measured, multiple economic storms. They survived the global financial crisis. They survived the .com crash. So there is resiliency built into that business. That, there's learning, there's institutional knowledge. And the interesting thing about IWG is, particularly at the senior levels, there are people that have been there for 25 years. So the depth of knowledge. One of the ladies that trained me when I joined on their systems was employee number 7. And the stories that she would tell about essentially sleeping on the floor of centers when they were kind of getting things up and running, and how much hustle culture there was in the early days of IWG, which is very much still there in a lot of ways.
So if you could just give 2 learnings from IWG to the co-working industry that they should pay attention to, what would those be?
That's a great one. Okay. So 2 learnings for smaller operators from IWG. The first one is IWG has an obsessive focus on cost control. So the entire company flies economy. So even when I was flying into company conferences from Australia, I was doing 16 hours in economy.
Oh, that is criminal.
The company has 10,000 employees, but it only has 2 corporate cars, one for Mark Dixon and one for the CFO. And they are BMW 5 Series. They're not fancy cars. They're just sort of mid-class BMWs. So there is no extravagance anywhere in IWG. And that's the first thing. IWG understands that this is a margin business. Everything we do is about making a margin over rent. It's primarily lease arbitrage. So obsessive cost control would be one of the first things to take away as a small operator, because it's the other amazing statistic I can give you, and this is all publicly available. So IWG has 10,000 employees in 4,000 locations. So if you do the math, they have about 2.5 employees per location, which that leads into the second learning, which IWG has incredible efficiency through systematizing their core operations. There's a big systems backbone at the middle of IWG, and everything from the way that leads flow in, the way that they're handled and distributed, the way that the centers operate, the way the billing is managed, the way that data is collected in the centers to help with billing, all of that is highly systematized. So the lesson for a small operator is automate everything you can, jump on the systems that are available. Like nowadays, this systems like Office R&D, which are absolutely fantastic, like operating platforms, mobile apps and the rest of them. So get the systems in as soon as you can. Try and keep your human costs controlled and make sure that humans are focused on doing the human things. So providing remarkable customer service, creating amazing events, building memories, building that sort of social muscle and emotional connection with the space, things that systems can't do.
So important. So important. In fact, I think the one place where people often miss in a co-working space is just on the greeting. Like, it's so essential. It's so important. And, I've walked into many a co-working space to be greeted by a piece of paper saying, here, call this number if you need help. Like, that's a massive failure in hospitality. What if you were trying to check into your hotel and you got a piece of paper instead? You'd lose your mind. So I do think we have a lot to learn still in the hospitality realm.
100%. I mean, we used to play a game in my spaces. So my front desk team would kind of play this game and try and remember everybody's name. So between them, they'd take sections of the client rosters and try and remember. So somebody on front desk knew. But this is also where systems come in. I think my largest center had 465 workstations. So would have had more than that in terms of clients.
So you need a biometric reader to read their face, and it needs to pop up on the screen in front of them being like, that's Jack Reed. So you can be like, hi, Jack, good morning.
It's very Minority Report, but I like it.
Well, Bob of People Squared in China had biometric readers 7 years ago. But it was funny. His staff was using photos of him to bypass the readers.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know where the time went. We're almost out of time. You definitely have to come back. We need to create our own little mini series. Maybe it's just around After Coworking. Ooh. Okay, thoughts. Okay, so we're going to do some rapid fire. Some of the questions aren't very rapid fire, but we're going to do it anyway. Okay, so what is one book or thinker that deeply influenced your work today?
I love pretty much everything by Malcolm Gladwell, but the book, The Tipping Point, really stuck with me.
Yeah, fantastic book. Most underrated aspect of hospitality in the co-working world?
Front desk team. So we talked a little bit about this, but it is the front desk team, that front desk experience. And actually, the fact that people will come up and just chat to them, they really are the social anchors of a space. And they're the people that your clients bond with. So they're absolutely critical.
I went to a co-working space in Austin yesterday because for 2 reasons. 1, I needed to be around other people. And 2, I hadn't had a chat with Christy in a while, who runs the center. And I wanted to talk to Christy. And that's why I went in.
That's amazing.
Okay, so you've built spaces and communities. What's the one lesson that took you years to learn that now seems so obvious?
So I learned this by expanding, and that was that communities change significantly with scale. So one of the most important elements in helping to maintain a happy, healthy co-working space is accountability. So how well your members know each other. So there's a lot of psychological research that shows when we're in environments where everybody knows each other and you know people's names, people behave better. They're more considerate. They don't shout on the phone. They know, so I call it cohesion in communities. So you lose cohesion with scale. It seems super obvious, but partly because I had one of my locations was split across 5 floors. It meant each of those floors were kind of small little micro communities. So every very high accountability. So when we moved into a huge footprint building with 500 plus customers, I noticed there was an increase in bad behavior, antisocial behavior. So we had to bring in more programming to make sure that we were really building in the relationships. And so by the time I sold Collective Works, we were running 52 events a year. We had, we're licensing. We were the event sponsor for TEDx Women. We also did GCUC in APAC. So we did a bunch of big conferences, but really regular events, because larger spaces require just much more engagement programming to get that cohesion.
Totally agree. So last question, where can we buy your book?
Amazon. So the Coworking Inc. is available on Kindle and in print. After Coworking is currently only available on Kindle because I made some last minute changes to make sure all the data in that was right up to the second. So we're just finishing updating the layout of the print book, and it'll be available in a week or 2. And then if you want to get in touch with me, my website is jonathanobern.com. So just find me there.
And those will all be in the show notes. And you can also catch Jonathan on stage at GCUC in Manchester.
Yes, you can.
Well, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you for writing a second book. I can't wait to read it. It's on the docket for this weekend. And I am really excited to see what you're going to do next, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me, Liz. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into the GC Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and follow us for more GC content. You can stay connected with us on social media by following us at GC Global. We're looking forward to having you join us next time for more insightful discussions. Until then, keep exploring the co-working world with the GC Podcast. Ciao.